For more on this, let's bring in Joseph Downing. He's a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. He joins me now live from Mexico. Great to have you here with us on TRT World. So the first question that I have on my mind is, why is the AfD winning in the former East? How is it different from the public sentiment in the western part of Germany?
Well, this is a fascinating question because we can see now some decades after German reunification, Germany, first of all, is a federal system, right? So politics is more kind of decentralized in Germany than it is in other European countries like France and the UK, for example. But Germany really does remain two separate Germanys, right? The East and the West on so many metrics, even decades after reunification and with billions of euros spent to try and bring the East up to the similar human development indices of the West, it hasn't worked. And we can see that Germany essentially exists really still as two Germanys. The East, having lost its industry on the collapse of communism in East Germany because it couldn't compete with a much more efficient West, economically has never come back, with a few sort of exceptions of particular cities that are thriving as sort of student centres. So Germany remains very divided economically. Also, there's an issue here culturally. So the Eastern German states that we're talking about are quite culturally isolated, and even worse so during the Cold War, right? That they were places where it was even difficult to pick up West German radio stations that were used very much by the Allies to kind of undermine communism. So this has got to be put into its context, and I think this is one of the issues that we're seeing here. We're seeing, a much more conservative political outlook from this part of Germany, but also a feeling a bit like we see really with areas in France that vote for the National Front, or areas in the US that vote for Donald Trump, or areas really in the United Kingdom that have voted for Brexit, that they are still left behind, that they really are the hinterlands that are being neglected by the government in Berlin. And also there's a sense here that they feel that they are out of step, I think, with a left-leaning, pro-Europe, kind of cautiously pro-migration Olaf Scholz. And the final point that I want to make here is that we have to see Germany in the context of the cost of living crisis. And given that these states generally are poorer than the West, the increasing costs of sort of basic foodstuffs, of energy, has hit people there hard. And I do think it's easy to see often these votes as being about xenophobia and racism, which is definitely true. But there's also an aspect to it where they're also kind of protest votes, right? A vote against the status quo. And I think that's something that we need to consider here as well.
So here's the thing, Joseph, do you think it's likely at some point that AfD's dominance in Thuringia is going to extend to other parts of Germany?
Other parts of East Germany, I think we can definitely expect them to have a good showing politically. But in terms of them winning national elections, or in terms of them winning any or gaining any kind of prominence in the richer western or southern states of Germany, I think that's A, impossible, or B, if it is something that is to come to pass, we're very, very far from that moment currently. And I think that's the thing, right? That there's a panic here about this kind of, the historical precedent, the historical legacy of the Second World War and the Holocaust in Germany and the rise of the Nazi government. We're not seeing that here. We have to be much more cautious, and we have to place this in its correct political context, which is essentially this is a kind of isolated win for a far-right party in a traditionally pretty much quite conservative sort of backwater of Germany in a sense, right? And I think we need to keep that very much in its context. We're not going to see this party having a good showing in the Rhineland or in Berlin anytime soon.
It's interesting, isn't it? The AfD's Thuringia chapter is officially classified as right-wing extremist by German security authorities. So what do you think this tells us about their success, tells us about the current state of political discourse in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, well, this is one of the problems with democracy, right? It is that the results don't always favor the center, right? The results that we see don't always favor the status quo. They don't always favor actually what's best for a state in this case, or a country in the case of many others that we see across the world. We can see the disastrous effects of the Brexit vote in the UK. Democracy doesn't always deliver kind of optimum outcomes, right? And I think that's something that we're kind of seeing here in this quite isolated sort of small part of Germany, is that, if people want to vote far right, they will. And even if this is a protest vote, even if this doesn't deliver good outcomes, even if this throws the East into chaos, then that unfortunately is one of the problems with democracy, really. And it's very difficult actually to really do much about it. So the German central government has attempted to sort of regulate, to classify this group as you rightly said, right, as extremists. But if people still turn out and vote, then what can you do? The other thing is, by classifying groups like this as extremists and by vilifying them, correct me or not, is not a value judgment I'm making here, right? But to vilify them in the discourse actually can give them more support, because one of the ways in which the far right thrives, and this is across Europe and globally, is with a persecution complex. So actually, paradoxically, the more you label them as far right, the more that they can say, "Oh, look, the establishment, the status quo doesn't like us and is trying to kind of keep us down, and we're the ones representing your interests." So paradoxically, by labeling them as extremists and by marginalizing them at the national level, at least locally, you can actually feed into their support base, because you're feeding into that sentiment that something's not right, and the true voice of the people, as all far right groups claim to be, which they're not, is being suppressed by the evil central government of establishment politicians.
Right. Now, Joseph, before I let you go, of course, this is the first time a party with Nazi roots has won a state election in Germany since World War II. I wonder, is this sentiment likely to extend into Europe? And do you think there might be a point where we will see similar parties gaining electoral victories in other parts of Europe?
Well, I think Germany paradoxically is actually behind in many parts of Europe in this regard, right? We've seen, the far right come to political prominence in Holland, in France, in the Nordic countries. We've seen the Brexit referendum and recent kind of race riots in the UK. So actually, Germany has actually held off the far right for longer than many other European states, and I definitely think this is a problem that's not going away anytime soon. Look, whether we're pro-immigration or anti-immigration, the issue of the border crisis essentially in the EU, the issue with things like the European Convention of Human Rights that prohibit the deportation of certain criminals because of their human rights, these kinds of things are very easy fodder for far right groups to take up and to make a political campaign from. And again, I don't think any of these structural concerns are going to be remedied anytime soon. The other key question about Europe and European politics is economics. So how much further will inflation, the cost of living crisis go? Housing shortages are endemic across most European democracies. Will governments be able to fix things like that? While we see, inflation cooling, thankfully, across much of Europe, we still see an issue here where individuals in many places are finding it hard to pay their bills. And I think this is one of the things that central governments, and this is not going to be easy to do by any means, but this is one of the things that central governments need to get a grip on.
Joseph Downing, thanks very much for talking to us here on TRT World. I really appreciate your taking out the time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.